University of the Free State's rector and vice-chancellor says recent campus violence dressed as activism should be condemned. Well, despite universities acting and negotiating in good faith, disgruntled groups often seek maximum disruption and destruction to get their point across. Well, how did we get here after decades of protest culture that actually helped change the course of South Africa's history? Professor Francis Peterson, the University of the Free State's vice-chancellor, joins me now. Prof. Peterson, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, student protests have played a massive role in liberating South Africa. We're looking at NUSAS, SASCO, etc. What's changed, in your opinion?
Good morning, Annika, and good morning to the viewers. Yes, protests did play an immense role in terms of the transformation of higher education. But what has happened recently is that protests always have been, up until now, being seen as a form of activism. And to a certain extent, it might have been disruptive in one way, but it always have been peaceful in another way. But what we've seen in the last couple of months, specifically playing out at various universities in South Africa, is that the protest has gone into stone throwing, into looting of dining halls, attacks on buildings, windows being broken, and it actually have moved from a protest to more criminality. And I think there are obviously various reasons, potential reasons for that. One that I can think of is the fact that some of our service delivery protests has become also to a certain extent violent, and our students actually comes out of the community. They do see that, and that they try to imitate the same. The second reason I also think is there, to a certain extent, are also political influences. Political influences sitting outside of the university, and then also impact on how students think, how they should act, but from a university management perspective, I think it's important that we call this out, that we act decisively, because criminality can't be tolerated on our campuses at universities in South Africa.
Prof, how do you actually distinguish between legitimate protests, such as, in many cases, fees must fall, and just sheer vandalism and, as you called it, criminality?
Yeah, so where there are legitimate protests, and legitimate protests often are about legitimate issues. And in fact, protests and activism in most cases are about legitimate issues. In this particular case, what happened in South Africa, some of the universities the last couple of months, is related to the National Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS. When they pay out allowances, how institutions deal with allowances that are not being paid out, and that they should stand in during those periods when there aren't funding coming from the NSFAS as such. Concessions that universities make in that instance. So those are legitimate issues, and often protests are if people don't get what they want. There's often an engagement. An engagement should happen on a continuous basis. Engagement, a negotiation. But what we've seen lately is that those engagements and negotiation happens. And if the students in this particular case don't get what they want, then there's a group, not all of them, there's a group in those student cohort, then they intend to go and try to vandalize and try to act or involved in criminal acts. So peaceful protest, that is clearly, you could see you have a negotiation in good faith, where it actually moved to criminality, actual vandalism. That's often driven by a small group, as I said before, and then you have to step in and you have to deal with that immediately.
It's a tricky one, Prof, because I think students throughout history will always justify their actions as being legitimate protest, and it's very uncomfortable seeing police actually clashing with students. So one has to wonder how many of these are actual students, and as you say, political parties moving in and outsiders who are not students. So it's something interesting to certainly watch as service delivery protests increase across the country. That's Professor Francis Peterson, University of the Free State's Rector and Vice-Chancellor. Thank you so much for your time.